The sky over Firebase Kestrel changed color at 3:17 hours. Sergeant Dava Marin was the first one out of her bunk, not because she had good instincts or fast reflexes, though she had both, but because she hadn't been sleeping. She'd been sitting on the edge of her cot in the dark, turning her sergeant's chevron over and over in her fingers the way she used to turn a coin, back when Earth still had coins worth turning. The chevron was a physical thing, heavy, something to hold when the rest of the world felt like it was made of smoke. She stepped outside, and the sky was the wrong color. Not red, not the amber of smoke from the refinery fires on the western ridge. It was a deep, bruised violet, the exact purple-black of a fresh impact contusion, and it pulsed. Once. Twice. Like something breathing. In the center of it, directly overhead, perfectly centered above the base as if it had been placed there, hung a light. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a flare. It was a sphere, roughly the size of a full moon but closer, much closer, close enough that she could see it rotate. It rotated the way a gyroscope rotates when it is doing something specific, with intent, with a kind of terrible mechanical certainty. She heard boots behind her. Corporal Elson, still pulling his jacket on. Then Lieutenant Cho, barefoot, eyes wide. Then the rest of them, stumbling out of the modular barracks one by one, staring upward with their mouths open, the way people always stare at things that are too large and too close and too deliberate to be natural phenomena. "Fire mission," Elson said. "That's not artillery," Marin said. "Satellite." "That's not a satellite." The sphere pulsed again. Something in the pulse reached into her sternum and pulled, the way a strong magnet pulls a compass needle, and she felt she could not explain this later, could not find words for it that didn't sound like she was losing her mind. She felt seen. As if the sphere had eyes, and every single one of them was looking directly at her. Then the light expanded, a single beam straight down, white gold and silent. It swallowed the base. She was still holding the chevron when the world went away. She came to on her feet, which was wrong. You don't come to on your feet. You wake up flat, confused, disoriented. You don't simply step from one reality into another with your boots already planted on the ground, standing upright, as if the universe had simply edited the location without bothering to change the body's position. But she was standing, and the ground under her boots was gray stone, warm, with a faint vibration in it like a machine running deep below. And she was not at Firebase Kestrel. The place was a village, or something that resembled a village the way a stage set resembles a real room. There were structures, low and close set, built from the same gray stone as the ground. There were lights, amber and steady, set into alcoves at regular intervals. There was a central square with a well in the middle that, when Marin walked to it and looked down, contained not water but light, a slow, circling luminescence, blue-white, that made no sound and cast no shadow. And there were people. Not her people, not Lieutenant Cho or Corporal Elson or anyone from Firebase Kestrel. These were people she had never seen, wearing clothes she couldn't immediately place, and they looked at her the way people look at a newcomer who has arrived unexpectedly but not entirely without expectation. Like they'd been told someone might show up. Like they were waiting to see who it would be this time. An old man came forward first. He was human, white-haired, wearing the remnants of a uniform so old she couldn't identify the branch or the era. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been in the same place for a very long time, and has learned not to waste energy. "Firebase," he said. "Kestrel, Sergeant Dava Marin, 3rd Expeditionary." He nodded as if this confirmed something. "They took you in the night." 3:17. "That's their usual window." He offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was dry and firm. "Sergeant Major Pell, I've been here 11 years by my count, though the counting gets approximate after a while." 11 years. She said nothing, let the number sit. "There's food," Pell said. "Come." The food was real. That was the first shock. She'd expected something alien, something engineered to sustain human physiology without consideration for preference or pleasure. Instead, there was bread, warm from something like an oven, and a thick broth that tasted of root vegetables, and a ceramic mug of something that was not quite tea but close enough to matter. She sat across from Pell at a stone table and ate, and he talked, and she listened. The place was called, in the language of its builders, something unpronounceable. The humans here called it the village. It had existed for at least a century, maybe longer. Pell had found records scratched into the lower levels of the well chamber that suggested a previous generation of residents, long gone. The builders, the captors, were the Vrath. An empire, not a species. A collection of adapted races united under a single command structure, the oldest and most dominant of which were the Vrathkin proper, the ones humans had taken to calling orcs because the word fit something in the ancestral vocabulary that no more precise term could reach. They were large. They were gray-green. They had tusks and close-set amber eyes and a formality of manner that you could, if you weren't paying attention, mistake for coldness. "They're not cold," Pell said, tearing his bread. "That's the thing you have to understand first, or you'll misread everything that happens here. They're formal. There's a difference. Why are we here?" He looked at his mug. "The Orc Queen, that's what we call her. There's no discourtesy in it. It's simply the closest translation for her actual title. She collects what she calls resonance cores. Every sentient being has one by her philosophy, a kind of soul signature, a frequency unique to each person, like a fingerprint made of sound. She's been collecting them." Marin set down her bread. "Collecting them. Not taking them, storing a copy, recording the frequency. Each person here, and there are 91 of us as of this morning, has had their resonance core documented, logged, filed." He paused. "The distinction matters enormously, but I will admit it took me several years to appreciate why." She looked around the village. There were others moving through it, men and women, varying ages, wearing pieces of gear from different periods, different branches, different wars. A woman who moved like a marine but wore a jacket Marin didn't recognize. An older man with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had spent a long time in a sniper's position. A young man sitting alone at the edge of the square, turning a small object over and over in his hands. A gesture she recognized. She'd come here turning her chevron. "The 91, she said. "They're all military." "Not exclusively. Pilots, scientists, 2 engineers, a journalist who was embedded with a combat unit when they took her," Pell considered. "The pattern, as far as I've been able to determine, is not occupation. It's something in the resonance core itself, something they respond to, something in certain humans that produces a frequency they find, I don't have a better word, interesting. And the collection, what does she do with it?" "At the moment, nothing." "What does she plan to do with it?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she understood the silence was not evasion but precision. He was choosing his words with the care of someone who knew how much weight words can carry. "That," Sergeant Major Pell said finally, "is the question." She met the Orc Queen on her 3rd day in the village. She hadn't sought the meeting. She'd been making circuits of the perimeter, mapping it the way she mapped everything, building a mental model of the space. Exits, observation points, structural weak spots, the locations of the lital coves which she'd identified as surveillance nodes, the spacing of the gray stone walls. When a door she'd passed 4 times without it being a door opened, and a figure stepped through it, and Marin stopped. She was tall. Not exceptionally so by Vrathkin standards, from what Marin had been told, but by human scale she was enormous, nearly 7 feet, broad-shouldered, wearing armor that was not the field armor of a warrior but the formal plate of a commander. Layered, articulated, engraved with geometric patterns that Pell had told her carried the equivalent of campaign medals. Her face was not what Marin had been prepared for. The amber eyes were calm, focused, and currently looking at Marin with an expression that was not threat and not welcome, but something in between, something that might have been assessment or recognition or both. She spoke, not to Marin, to the small figure at her side, an interpreter, a young Vrathkin female who looked like a student, wearing no armor at all, carrying a data tablet. The interpreter said, "The Sovereign asks if you have found the village acceptable." Marin said, "I've found it educational." The interpreter translated. The Sovereign listened. And then she did something Marin would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward. She smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, not the performance of pleasantness. Something small and real, at the corner of her mouth, there and gone, as if the answer had confirmed something she had suspected and the confirmation pleased her. "She says," the interpreter relayed, "that is the correct answer." They met 7 more times in the following month. Not interrogations. Marin waited for the interrogations and they never came. No one asked for tactical information, unit strength, command structures, supply lines. No one asked for anything. They sat across from each other in a small chamber off the main square, and the Sovereign asked questions that felt more like a naturalist's field study than an intelligence-gathering operation. What did Marin value most in a fellow soldier? What decision in her life did she consider her best, her worst? When she was frightened, what did she do with the fear? Marin answered carefully, giving enough to seem cooperative while holding back anything that felt operationally sensitive. But she had, by the 4th meeting, begun to suspect that the Sovereign already knew everything that was operationally sensitive, and that what she was after was something else entirely. On the 5th meeting, she asked about the resonance cores. "You document them," Marin said, "but you don't use them. I want to understand why." The Sovereign listened to the translation. Then she spoke at length, and the interpreter worked through it with the methodical precision of someone translating not just words but context. She says, "The resonance core is not a resource. It cannot be burned for fuel. It cannot be turned into a weapon without destroying what makes it valuable. To convert a resonance core into a power source is like feeding a library to a fire for warmth. You get heat. You lose everything that made the fuel worth something." The interpreter paused. "She says this is what Vareth wants to do. She says this is why you are here and not somewhere else." "Vareth, a name," Marin filed it. "Who is Vareth?" the interpreter asked. The Sovereign answered, and something changed in her voice. A flatness entered it, a careful absence of inflection that Marin recognized as the sound of very disciplined anger. "Her cousin," the interpreter said, "commander of the 3rd Expansion Fleet. He believes the resonance cores of a sufficient number of humans, 100, can be synthesized into a broadcast signal capable of disrupting human cognitive function on a planetary scale, the equivalent of a frequency that, if played loudly enough, would silence all resistance, permanently." A pause. "He has been attempting to collect 100 cores for 3 years. She has been ensuring he does not. The village exists to prevent him from reaching that number." Marin let the silence run. Outside, the ambient light of the village hummed its steady amber. "So we're hostages," she said. "No," the interpreter said, without needing to consult the Sovereign, as if the word had been anticipated. "You are the reason the number cannot be completed. You are here because while you are here, Vareth cannot reach you. And while Vareth cannot reach you, he cannot reach 100. Marin said quietly, "And when I go home?" The Sovereign had not needed the translation. She was watching Marin's face, and she answered before the interpreter could relay the question, and what she said was brief. "When you go home," the interpreter said, "you take your core with you, and you go home knowing where the door is." On the 32nd day, Corporal Elson found her. She had not expected Elson to be here. He was not in the village. She had looked for faces she recognized among the 91 and found none. But he came through the same door she had come through, disoriented, standing upright, still wearing his half-pulled jacket. He looked exactly as he had looked when he stepped out of the barracks at Firebase Kestrel, which meant the beam had taken him too, perhaps simultaneously, perhaps with a delay she hadn't been able to measure. She said his name and he turned, and the relief on his face was the relief of someone who has been very alone in a very strange place, for exactly as long as it takes to lose confidence in your own perceptions. "Sergeant," he said, "what in the—" "I'll explain," she said. "Come eat something first." She explained. He asked good questions. She gave him straight answers, including the ones that were uncomfortable. The resonance cores, Vareth, the number 100, the fact that they were here because being here kept them out of someone else's hands. He was quiet for a while after she finished. Then he said, "So she's protecting us. In the way that a vault protects what's inside it. But she could have used us. Whatever Vareth wants to do with the cores, she could have done it first." "Yes. Why didn't she?" Marin had asked herself this question 32 days running. Because she thinks there's something in the cores worth keeping, and using them destroys what's worth keeping. Elson turned this over. He stopped. "I was going to say that's an odd thing for a conqueror to believe." "She's not a conqueror, she's a collector." "What's the difference?" "Conquerors want what you can do. Collectors want what you are." She found Sergeant Major Pell that evening by the well chamber, sitting on the low stone wall around it, watching the blue-white light circle. He was doing what she was doing, turning something over in his hands. His was a small photograph, worn smooth at the edges, the image no longer visible from any distance. Personal talisman. She recognized the type. "You've been here 11 years, she said. "Thereabouts. Do you want to go home?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have a daughter," he said. "She was 7 when they took me. She's 18 by now or thereabouts. I'd very much like to meet who she's become." He paused. "But I also know that the moment I leave, my slot opens. And Vareth fills it. Unless we can stop Vareth from filling it." He looked at her. The look was old and careful and not unkind. "You've been building up to something," he said. "I can hear it in the way you've been asking questions." "The broadcast signal," she said. "The synthesis of 100 cores into a planetary disruption frequency. How does it work?" "I'm not a physicist." "Neither am I, but you've been here 11 years and you've been paying attention. What do you know?" He told her what he knew. It took most of the night. He knew more than he'd let on, and she was not surprised. She'd have done the same, rationing information until she was sure of her audience. What emerged from the hours of careful telling was a picture with gaps, but the picture had enough shape to work with. Vareth's synthesis required a central resonator, a chamber, somewhere on his vessel, where the 100 cores would be input simultaneously and processed into the broadcast frequency. The processing took approximately 11 hours from initiation to broadcast. Once initiated, it could not be interrupted from outside. It could only be interrupted from inside. From within the resonator chamber itself. "Who told you this?" she said. "The Sovereign." "Why?" He was quiet. "She told you so you'd know," Marin said. "So you'd have the information. So when someone came along who might use it, it would be ready." "I've been here 11 years, Pell said. "She's been patient." "She didn't know who to give it to." "She knew she'd recognize the right person when she arrived." Marin sat with that for a moment. Then, "What's the core count?" 93, as of this morning." 93. She needs 7 more empty slots and she's protected everyone she can get to. Vareth needs 7 more and he's done. More or less. So the protection runs out. "It always was going to," Pell said, without self-pity, "the way you state a fact about weather. The village was never a permanent solution. It was a delay, long enough for something else to become possible." She spent 4 days working the problem from every angle she could find. She talked to the Marine woman, whose name was Specialist Jorah Kane, who had been here 3 years and was a combat engineer with detailed working knowledge of resonator technology from the human side of the war. She talked to the physicist, a Dr. Mlen, who had been taken 8 years ago and who spoke about resonance frequencies with the focused clarity of someone who has had a great deal of time to think about exactly one problem. She talked to Elson, who had no specialized knowledge but whose second pair of eyes and instinctive pattern recognition had saved her twice in the field. And she talked to the sovereign. She went to the door in the wall and knocked. It opened. She sat across from the sovereign in the small chamber and looked at her and said, without preamble, "I need to get to Varith's vessel." The interpreter started to translate. The sovereign raised one hand, a human gesture. She'd picked it up from the village, stopped, and looked at Marin steadily. "She says," the interpreter said, "she knows." And a longer exchange. The interpreter's voice went careful and even. "She says, there is a transit system between this location and the fleet anchorage, a maintenance passage, unmanned. If she routes access to you, you can reach the anchorage in 4 hours. The resonator chamber is 2 decks below Varith's command position. It is not heavily guarded because Varith does not expect anyone to reach it from inside because no one should know it exists." A pause. She says, "If you initiate a counter-resonance pulse from inside the chamber, Dr. Mlen can give you the frequency. You will disrupt the synthesis permanently. The equipment cannot be recalibrated. It's a singularity device. One use. If you corrupt the initiation, Varith will never be able to complete the broadcast." "What happens to me in the chamber when I initiate the pulse?" the interpreter asked. The sovereign answered. The interpreter was quiet for a moment. "She says it is unclear. The counter-resonance will interact with your core. You may survive it, you may not." A pause. "She says she believes you will." "Why?" "She says, because she has been watching your frequency since you arrived, and it is not the frequency of someone whose story ends in a chamber." Marin almost smiled. It was the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she believed it, and she was not entirely sure those 2 facts didn't say something important about where she was and who she was talking to. She said, "If I do this, the synthesis is broken. Varith can't complete the broadcast, but he still has 93 cores." "Yes." "And the village?" the interpreter asked. The answer was long. "She says, the village ceases to be necessary. If the synthesis capability is destroyed, individual cores have no strategic value. They cannot be combined. They cannot be weaponized. She will release everyone here." A pause. She says, "She has always intended to release everyone here. The village was not a prison, it was a waiting room." Another pause, and the interpreter's voice shifted slightly, as if translating something that required care. "She says she is aware that from the inside the distinction is not always apparent. She says she is sorry for the time it has cost." Marin looked at her. The sovereign met her look without deflection, the amber eyes steady, and there was something in those eyes that Marin could only identify as the look of someone who has held a weight for a very long time and is asking without asking whether someone can help carry it. She said, "I'm going to need Elson and Kane." The sovereign nodded. She had understood without translation. The transit system was exactly what the sovereign had described. A maintenance passage, functional and Spartan, lit by the same amber alcove lights as the village but spaced farther apart, the stretches between them long enough that Marin spent significant time moving through near darkness. Behind her, Elson moved with the quiet of someone who had learned to be quiet in dark places. In front, Kane led with the economy of motion of a combat engineer who knew the difference between cover and concealment and was always thinking about which one she was behind. They had 4 hours. Dr. Mlen had given Marin a small device, 3 components assembled in 20 minutes from materials Kane had sourced across the village in 2 hours once they knew what they were looking for. The components were mundane. The assembly was not. The frequency it would emit, Dr. Mlen had explained with the calm precision of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this conversation for 8 years, would create a recursive interference pattern in the resonator's harmonic field, a feedback loop. The synthesis would corrupt itself. Every core already loaded would be released, inert. The resonator would never function again. You have to be inside the chamber when you activate it, Emlen had said. The field is contained. The walls are shielded. You go outside before you activate it. The signal damps before it reaches the core of the system. And if I'm inside, you're inside the field. And my resonance core will interact with the counter frequency. Yes, she had met Marin's eyes over her assembled device. I believe the interaction will be survivable. I believe this because I have modeled it 617 times in 11 years, and the mathematics consistently suggests survivability. But I want you to know that mathematics and reality are not the same thing. I know, Marin said. I appreciate you telling me. The fleet anchorage was enormous. She had not fully grasped in the abstract what an empire's fleet looked like at anchor until she was inside it, moving through its maintenance corridors, past conduits as large as highway tunnels, past structural supports so large you could build a building inside them, past the constant, deep-register thrum of drive systems on standby. It was the thrum she had felt in the village floor, she realized. The stone of the village sat directly on the hull of the anchorage, and the thrum was always there, the heartbeat of the machine. They reached the resonator chamber in 3 hours and 40 minutes, faster than projected, because Kane had found a secondary access route that cut 2 passages and a checkpoint. The chamber was exactly where the Sovereign's information had placed it, 2 decks below Vareth's command position, behind a door that was not locked but required a specific frequency input to open. A security measure so sophisticated it was trivially defeated by the access codes the Sovereign had provided, which Marin had memorized rather than written down. The chamber was large, spherical nearly. The walls were curved and smooth and covered in input nodes, small sockets, each one designed to receive a single resonance core. There were 93 nodes occupied, small lights, not red or green, not color-coded in any way she could read, just lights, 93 small lights in the curve of a spherical wall. She thought about what they were, 93 people. Most of them still in the village. A few, Pell had mentioned a handful, over the years, who had been taken by Vareth through methods the Sovereign hadn't been able to block. 93 people's specific, individual, unrepeatable frequencies. 93 copies of the things that made people exactly themselves. She stood in the center of the chamber and looked at all of them and felt the weight of that number. Elson said quietly from the doorway, "We're good out here." Kane said, "You have about 6 minutes before the maintenance cycle brings a scanner past through this corridor." Marin looked at the device in her hand. 3 small components. Dr. Emlen's 8 years of careful mathematics. She thought about Pell's photograph, worn smooth. She thought about the young man in the square turning something over in his hands. She thought about the Sovereign's small, real, private smile. She thought about her chevron, which was in her jacket pocket right now, and the way she'd been turning it on the edge of her cot at 3:17 hours on the day her world changed. She activated the device. The field was not violent. She had expected violence, arcing current, visible energy, the dramatic discharge of something enormous being disrupted. What she got was a sound. Low, pervasive, felt more than heard, a deep harmonic tone that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The input nodes flickered. The 93 small lights went out, one by one, not in sequence but all at once. A simultaneous release, like opening 93 hands at the same moment. Then the frequency hit her. She had no framework for what happened next. She was standing, and then she was not standing, and the chamber was everywhere and nowhere at once, and something that felt like her but was not precisely her was examined and measured and released, and the release was not a diminishment but an expansion, a brief and overwhelming sense of size, And then she was on her hands and knees on the floor of the chamber, and Elson was through the door with his hands on her shoulders before she had fully registered that she was on the floor. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you. Can you walk?" She took a breath. "Yes." "The nodes are dead, all of them. Kane says the whole chamber went offline. We need to move." "I know." She let him get her to her feet. She felt hollowed out, but not emptied. The difference was important, though she couldn't have explained it in that moment. Like a vessel that has been scoured clean. She was still entirely herself. She was, in fact, more precisely herself than she had been before, as if the counter-frequency had stripped away some ambient noise she hadn't known was there. They moved. Varith found them in the fourth corridor. She had known he would find them. The Sovereign's plan had not included a quiet exit. Varith was not what she expected. She had expected the formal bearing of command, the deliberate weight of someone who had spent years accumulating power. What she found was a Vrathkin who was vibrating with fury in the way of someone who has just watched a decade of careful work dissolve in the space of a maintenance cycle. He was taller than the Sovereign, broader, and his eyes were not amber but a pale, cold gray. And they were fixed on Marin with an expression that was not assessment but pure, undifferentiated rage. He had guards, 8 of them, full combat armor, weapons drawn. Marin raised her hands, empty. He spoke. The translation came from somewhere behind him, a small device clipped to his chest armor, auto-translating, the voice flat and synthetic. "You have destroyed 11 years of work." "Yes." "You understand what you are. A primitive, a mammal from a single contested world. Your kind has been at war for less than a century, and you walk onto my ship and—" "The chamber is destroyed," she said. "The synthesis capability is gone. The cores you collected are released. You don't have what you came for, and you never will." She kept her hands up and her voice even. "And the woman who has been making sure of that for 11 years sent me to finish it. So whatever you were going to say about primitive mammals, I'd consider whether it still applies." The cold gray eyes flickered, not to her, past her. She turned. The Sovereign was standing at the end of the corridor. She had not come through the transit system. She had her own access, apparently, to her cousin's vessel, which made a kind of terrible family logic sense. She was in her formal armor, and she was flanked by her own guard, and she was looking at Varith with an expression that was not rage and not triumph, but the expression of someone who has been holding a position for 11 years and has finally been relieved. They spoke. Marin caught none of it. The auto-translator on Varith's chest had cut out, perhaps overridden, but the conversation was not long. Varith's fury went through several stages, each one shorter than the last, as if the air was going out of it. The Sovereign spoke 3 times in measured sentences, and each time she spoke Varith seemed slightly smaller than he had been. The last thing the Sovereign said, she said looking not at Varith but at Marin. Marin didn't need the translation for that one. She had been watching the Sovereign's face for enough weeks to read it without words. It meant now. There was a fight. She would not pretend there wasn't. Varith had guards and she had Elson and Kane in her hands, and the fact that Varith's guards were looking at the Sovereign's guard and making calculations about engagement probability that gave Marin approximately 4 seconds of confusion to work with. She used them. Kane hit the lighting conduit with something improvised and effective. Elson was already moving. Marin crossed the distance to the Sovereign's position with the specific economy of motion that comes not from training, but from the moment you stop thinking about what you're doing and simply do it. The Sovereign's guard closed around them. The corridor went loud and then quiet and then loud again. When it was over, Varith was detained. His guards were either down or standing with their hands empty and their weapons on the floor, in the universal posture of people who have done the math and reached the correct conclusion. Elson had a cut on his forearm that would need stitching. Kane had not been touched, which was impressive and entirely in character. Marin had a bruised rib and the hollow scoured feeling in her chest that was not weakness but was not strength either. Something between. Something she would need days to understand. She looked at the Sovereign. The Sovereign looked at her. The interpreter was there. She had come through with the guard, practical, ready. But the Sovereign spoke first and the interpreter went still and let the words happen, because some things don't need to be relayed. The Sovereign reached into a compartment on her chest armor, removed a small object, held it out. It was an icon, the word Pell had borrowed from her language. Spherical, smooth, the size of a large marble, with a light inside it that cycled slowly through blue-white. Marin stared at it. "She preserved your core specifically," the interpreter said quietly when the Sovereign had held the gesture long enough. "From the moment you arrived, not as data in the synthesis inventory, separately, distinctly, she says a pause. She says she knew from the first measurement that yours would not work for the synthesis, that it would be too loud, too specific. Too, she uses a word that means roughly directed, the opposite of broadcast." The interpreter's voice was careful and even. "She says she kept it because she wanted you to be able to find your way back, that a resonance core, properly kept, functions as a beacon, that it can call a person home from anywhere if the person knows to listen for it." A pause. "She says she kept it because she believed you would leave, and she believed you would come back, and she wanted the door to always be there when you did." Marin looked at the small sphere in the Sovereign's hand, the slow blue-white light. She thought about the night she'd sat on the edge of her cot at 3:17 hours, turning her chevron, not sleeping, the weight of a rank she wasn't sure she'd earned in her fingers. She thought about the sky going wrong. She thought about Pell and his photograph and his 11 years and his daughter who was 18 now and had grown up without him. She thought about what the Sovereign had just done, over 11 years, quietly and without announcement. Built a vault not to contain people, but to keep them out of reach of someone who would have used them up. Held a number below a threshold at enormous cost to herself, in a war within a war that most of the people she was protecting didn't know was happening. She reached out and took the small sphere. It was warm, and when it sat in her palm she felt she could not explain this later, could not find the words. She felt like herself, specifically herself. The way you feel when you come home after a long time away and the key still fits the lock and the smell of the place is exactly what you remembered and something in your body says, "Yes, here, this is the right coordinates." "The village," she said, "how long until they're released?" "She has already sent the orders," the interpreter said. "The transit system is open. They will be home within the day." 93 people. Pell and his 11 years and his photograph. The Marine and the physicist and the engineer and the journalist and all the others, going home to their own right coordinates, their own locked doors with keys that still fit. Marin closed her hand around the small sphere. "Tell her," she said to the interpreter, "that I'll be back." The interpreter relayed it. The Sovereign listened. And she smiled, the same smile Marin had seen on the third day in the village, the first meeting in the small stone chamber, the smile that was real and private and not a performance. The smile that had confused everyone who saw it and would go on confusing them, because it looked like a conqueror's satisfaction, but was something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name in any of the languages currently spoken between their two peoples. Something that might, given sufficient time, acquire one. Marin pocketed the sphere. The warm weight of it against her hip was a steady thing, a known thing. She walked back through the transit system with Elson on her left and Kane on her right, and the amber lights of the passage pulsed at regular intervals. And under her feet the deep thrum of the anchorage was present and familiar now, the heartbeat of a machine that was, for this moment, not an engine of war, but simply the sound of something enormous at rest. At Firebase Kestrel, the sun was coming up when they came through. Not the wrong color, not violet dark and pulsing, just orange and specific and warm on her face, the ordinary miracle of a star doing its ordinary work. She stood in the dust of the base and let it hit her and breathed. Elson stood beside her, not talking, looking east. Kane was already moving toward the communications array, because there were people who needed to know things, and she was the kind of person who got that sorted before she thought about anything else. Marin put her hand in her jacket pocket, touched the chevron, then the sphere, both of them there, the old weight and the new one. She thought about Pell, somewhere in the transit corridor right now maybe, moving toward the exit. Moving toward the daughter who was 18 and had grown up without him, and didn't know yet that today was the day that changed. She thought about the Sovereign, standing in the corridor of her cousin's ship with her guard around her and the situation in hand, and the small real smile. Nobody had understood it. Even the people who'd seen it, and there had been witnesses, there were always witnesses, had looked at that smile on the face of the Orc Queen and reached for the obvious explanation, satisfaction, victory, the pleasure of a plan fulfilled. They saw someone who had gotten what she wanted. They were wrong about what she had wanted. She had wanted 93 people she'd never met to make it home. She had wanted one of them to come back. She had wanted, for 11 years, in a war that wasn't hers to end alone, to hold a number below a threshold long enough for something else to become possible. And she had smiled because, finally, it had. Marin turned the chevron over in her fingers. The sun climbed. Somewhere in the transit system, 93 people were finding their way toward exits they hadn't known existed, stepping out into the worlds they'd come from, carrying the ordinary miracle of the life they'd left. She'd be back. She'd told the Sovereign, and she'd meant it. There was a door now. She knew where it was. She knew how to listen for the frequency that called her home from anywhere. She turned her face to the east and let the sun do its work. Behind her, the base was beginning to wake.